Hello, listeners. I'm Julia Aoki with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy podcast. Below the Radar is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. On this episode of Below the Radar, our host, Johal, is joined by Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg scholar, writer, and artist. and Leanne chat about her creative process, the significance of Nishnaabeg thought and practice in her work, and some upcoming projects, including her newest book, Theory of Water, set to be published in spring of 2025. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, welcome to Below the Radar. Delighted that you could join us again this week. We have a special guest with us in studio here at 312 Main. You can hear the voices inside because we're not quite, professional recording studio. But it's great to have Leanne Simpson with us. Leanne, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
Yeah, Leanne, I'm wondering if we can begin with you introducing yourself a little bit.
Sure. My name is Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, and I'm Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg. I'm a band member of Alderville First Nation, and I'm a writer and a musician and an intellectual, I guess. I guess that's what you would call me.
Well, Leanne, it's been wonderful to get to know you over the years. You've come and spoken at SFU a number of times. I think the first time was over a decade ago, where our mutual friend Glenn had you come out to speak at SFU. And it's remarkable to me the range of work that you take on, from your own academic theoretical writing to your own creative work in terms of short stories and novels and other work. And of course, your music. How do you keep all of those things together? Each of those on their own require a dedication to craft and work. But do you draw a kind of distinction between those works, or this is just something that naturally comes to you in terms of the forms that your creative resistance takes?
It comes really naturally to me. So I think that I'm just doing what I'm doing. A lot of what I do, I think, brings me a lot of joy and is very, very meaningful to me. I have trouble being engaged in projects and institutions and organizations that aren't meaningful to me. So I think that's sort of one of the drivers. I think that at least initially, I was really, really interested in sort of falling into Anishinaabe thought and embodying that and seeing where that kind of creative energy and creative sovereignty took me. And it doesn't fit into the genres and the disciplines in the same way that I think Western practices do. So I think that that's another sort of element of it, is that none of what I do particularly fits into the categories and the boxes that are available. So I find a lot of creative energy in those interstitial spaces.
Mm-hmm. Which is, I lived in the Middle East for a year and met with many Palestinian organizations, not unlike many people that I met there, that, somebody was a poet, a writer, a journalist, and doing human rights work on the side. It was very much a coherent set of practices. I'll start with asking, you've done a lot of projects in the last number of years, but maybe I'll start with some of your work, What We Have Always Done, where that project came from.
I think at the time I was interested in sort of Indigenous resurgence and what happens when you refuse the politics of recognition and you turn inside Indigenous thought. And so for me, Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg thought and practice, what kind of theory does one embody? What are the practices? What are the ethics? What is the political economy? What are the alternatives to racial capitalism and heteropatriarchy and colonialism? And so that book, I think, was a sort of refusal and then a generative sort of space where I was thinking through, or trying to think through, those things from within Anishinaabe thought and practice. And I think at the time, now when I look back, even on Dancing on Our Turtle's Back and As You Have Always Done, there's sort of an insular quality to it, where I'm not just sort of refusing the state, but I'm sort of falling into Anishinaabe thought and indigeneity in a way that isn't necessarily connected to other anti-colonial practices and movements and struggles. And I think what I learned from writing Dancing on Our Turtle's Back and sort of living in a particular way in order to generate that book, and then again going through that sort of same practice of being in the bush a lot and working with elders and working with language a lot and ceremony and coming up with As You've Always Done, and then moving to rehearsals for living, is that at some point it sort of dawned on me that Anishinaabe worlds are very deep networks with deep reciprocity and relationality, kind of spanning a certain time and space that's inclusive of the future and of the past, that's very focused on the present. And I started to think about how Anishinaabe worlds and the worlds that I was interested in building were linking up to other anti-colonial struggles. So I started to not be so insular and started to think about how these worlds in my practice were connected to these other struggles and these other people that I was sharing the planet with, that I was sharing time and space with. And so that is sort of, I think, still where I am. It's something that I guess when I look back, of course, Anishinaabe knowledge is very intimate and local and international and concerned with these kind of planetary crises that we're facing.
Mm-hmm. Last year I had a chance to see you at the Indian Summer Festival, and earlier in the year, Robin Maynard came to do a talk at SFU on the book that you worked on together. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to how that collaboration started and what that was like for you to work together.
So I think for me, this kind of waking up and realizing that I wanted to start to link up to the other communities and peoples that I was sharing time and space with sort of gave me a little bit of I was starting to be attentive to what the Black community was doing in Toronto in a way that I hadn't in the past, or hadn't been as attentive in the past. And so when I was doing the book launch for As We Have Always Done, and I was in Montreal, I wanted to be in conversation with Robin, who had just come out with Policing Black Lives. And so we did a book launch together in Montreal and had this fantastic conversation and started thinking more about solidarity, more about our own kind of relationality in the communities and struggles that we were involved in. We spent some time in the North, Johal and Leanne's Dene territory at a solidarity gathering, and we started to sort of have all these plans about how we were going to deepen our own relationship to each other in a political sort of sense, but also in a friendship sort of sense. And then the pandemic happened. And a lot of our plans for visiting with freedom schools and coming to the Sugar Bush and, walking the streets of Toronto in a way that reveals Michi Saagiig history, Haudenosaunee history, and also Black history, I think, didn't get to happen. And so we started to write letters to each other through the pandemic, through the global Black uprising in the summer of 2021. Not intending to write a book, just as a way of educating ourselves and thinking alongside each other, that sort of Black feminist practice of thinking alongside rather than that kind of academic debating, cutthroat kind of debating. And so eventually Robin went for a walk with Dion Brand, and Dion asked sort of what she was up to, and she talked about this letter writing project, and Dion wanted to see it, and then it sort of became a book after that.
Great.
Yeah.
I had a chance to speak with you earlier on an earlier podcast on your album Theory of Ice that came out a couple of years ago, and at the time you had mentioned also recording Willie Dunn's Pity the Country. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to those projects and kind of what you're working on in regards to music.
Yeah, so the last full-length record that I released is Theory of Ice, and we did a cover of Willie Dunn's I Pity the Country, and Willie Dunn was a Mi'kmaq singer-songwriter. He was active in the late 1960s and 1970s. He was also part of the Red Power movement. He was an activist. And I was invited to perform at a Native North American gathering in Ottawa. And I was, we were doing a 3-song set. We were sort of the young people on the bill, which I loved. And it was at the National Arts Center. And I wanted to do a cover of Willie because he couldn't be there, right? Because he's no longer with us. And I knew his family was going to be there, and I knew his kind of crew was going to be there. So I was listening to his old songs, and I Pity the Country just spoke to me. I felt like I could step up to the mic and say every one of the words. There's like a couple of real kind of 60s lines, but for the most part, the politics haven't changed and the sentiment hasn't changed. I changed the one line, they pull and they paw me. I changed it to they rape and they beat me as a way of gesturing towards the work that we've done as a community around missing and murdered Indigenous women. So that night, right before my band goes on stage, the Colton Bushy verdict comes down. And Rosanna Deerchild was the host, and she broke the news to the audience that the man had been acquitted. And so it was this moment where people, I think, felt this tremendous sense of injustice. And then I was the next person to sort of step up to the mic. And that was the song that we were doing, is I Pity the Country. And so that was the first time that we performed it. And I think I realized, I saw sort of Willie Thrasher and Linda Saddleback and Willie Mitchell were in the front row. Willie Dunn's family was there. I saw the power of that song in that present moment. And we recorded it sort of as a demo right after that because we wanted to sort of capture the energy in the room that night. And then every time we've performed it, there's been something that has happened in terms of colonialism, where that song is a way of speaking back to whatever struggle is happening in the moment. And so it's become something that's really special to perform.
You were interviewed recently in the local paper, the Source, around theory of water. Wondering if you can speak about that. I
should mention, though, with I Pity the Country, that Lisa Jackson and Connor McNally and I just did a video that we released on Truth and Reconciliation Day for the video. And it's Willie Dunn was also a filmmaker.
Yeah, and great NFB documentaries as well as others, yeah.
Right. So the idea was to make an archival short film based on all of that footage from the Indian film crew and through the history of the NFB with Indigenous filmmakers. And so it's sort of it's a really beautiful protest sort of film where you can see Frank Tiselli and the Berger Inquiry. You can see Haida Gwaii. You can see sort of this history of resistance and protest. And so, yeah, people should check that out on YouTube.
Yeah, it's a Ballad of Crowfoot, and I did another one on the HBC.
Yeah, which is recognized as sort of the first music video in Canada, which is pretty cool. Yeah. Yeah, so Theory of Water is a new book that I'm working on that's coming out in the spring of 2025. And it's just picking up on this idea of sort of Anishinaabe internationalism and how we make worlds, how we relate to other anti-colonial peoples making worlds, solidarity. Where do we look for theory and inspiration and the generative kind of thinking in terms of land-based practices? And water is one that really spoke to me, the global water cycle, the water that is inside of me, that's outside of me, that kind of has a permeability to it, that changes form from a gas to a solid to a liquid, and that connects all of the different forms of life on the planet. So I spend a lot of time thinking about water and thinking about what it means in terms of organizing and making worlds. And so I'm just sort of in the editing process for that. And it's really wonderful to be in Vancouver because I feel like this community has been really, really supportive of my work over the last 10 years. And so it's a good time for me to work out any of the bugs in the manuscript. There's something about when you say it out loud into a mic where you're like, oh, that sentence needs a little more shine.
Besides your writing, are there other projects and collaborations you're currently working on?
I'm working on a novel called The Breathing Lands, which is it's a novel in 7 short stories. And I'm working on a new record as well. We've got maybe 6 or 7 demos. And it's the record's a little bit of a departure in terms of process. So the music is coming first, and then I'm writing lyrics to the music, and I'm writing the vocal lines as well. So that project is really, I'm really enjoying it. I think the pandemic has been really difficult for musicians and for bands in particular. And so it's always a struggle, but it's something that's bringing me a lot of joy.
Mm-hmm. Now, because a number of people who will be listening to this podcast and sort of based out of an art school at SFU, there's always a lot of questions around collaboration and creative process and those types of things in each of the areas that you work, from writing theory to creative projects to music. What are some of the things you've learned or developed as an artist from the way that you started to make work, say, when you were in a teenager, early 20s, to now? How has your own creative process evolved?
I think I've learned to protect the part of me that can create. And so that is very, very important. So that's things like boundaries and saying no and taking care and paying attention to sort of your mind and your heart and making sure that those are in good places. I think that writing is it's a muscle, and it can be a struggle, but it's something that is learned and practiced and a skill. And so I think there's a work ethic, that goes into writing. For writers, rarely does the sort of book or the song sort of come from a divine place and just flow through me and out onto the page. It's often a struggle to get that shitty first draft. And then I think in my early days, I would do 1 or 2 drafts or 3 drafts. And now I do 20 drafts, or the editing process has become much more labor intensive, I guess. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You had mentioned, Leanne, that you had a chance to go to the Palestine Literature Festival and chance to travel through and meet with other artists and writers. Wondering if you can speak a little bit about that.
Sure. I was one of the international writers at the Palestine Festival of Literature in May of this year. And so I traveled. That's a traveling festival, so it's a really beautiful part of it that there's a group of sort of international writers that meets in Amman, Jordan, and then we crossed through the Allenby Bridge and drove into Ramallah, and then sort of traveled around the West Bank and 48, doing different events with Palestinian writers from the diaspora and from inside Palestine. And then also meeting with freedom fighters and community activists and artists and different projects during the day. So there was sort of a political education component of the project as well. I had a very visceral reaction to being there, which I was surprised because it's a very different climate. It's a very different landscape. It's a very different culture. But I felt very at home, very well taken care of, very loved, and sort of a kinship with Palestinians facing all kinds of violence from settler colonialism that was so similar to, I think, what Indigenous peoples in North America have faced over the past 400 years. But interestingly enough, you can see sort of all of the stages of settler colonialism happening at the same time, with a state that has military power that is not from the 1800s. So it was something that was, I felt like I thought that I was going to learn a lot about the Palestinian struggle, and I did. But I learned a lot about myself, and I learned a lot about what it means to be Indigenous and struggle against colonialism. And so I felt like I really deepened my relationship to a lot of different Palestinian artists and writers and people while I was there.
I want to ask you, Leanne, about, you've had a long-standing connection with alternative education projects sort of outside the academy, although you have a PhD and you are comfortable in that world as well. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to, I know you're involved with Gizhiiwe, but probably many other educational experiments and projects that are outside of the usual frame of academic teaching contexts.
Yeah, well, I mean, I thought a lot about how education works within Anishinaabe society, and how learning was lifelong, how people were encouraged to follow their own interests and what they were good at, and foster this sense of self-determination inside a set of ethical responsibilities and commitments to the community and to the land. And I thought a lot about how there was people of all ages and abilities sort of interacting, getting up in the morning, figuring out how to make a world, making that world together as a way of life, as a way of generating life, as a way of generating knowledge and sharing that knowledge, and how those kinds of formations were full of care. And so that seemed to me like a really wonderful way of making a world and living in a world. And so I think initially I tried to do that in the classroom at university. And I think there's lots of ways that you can support students and support sort of learning communities. And there's lots of barriers to doing that at the university as well, in terms of grading and marks and syllabi and the structure. And so I think that I've always kind of pushed back against those kinds of systems. And I've spent a lot of time with myself and with my own kids who have been homeschooled for their whole schooling experience until now. One of them is in university, but just thinking really broadly about what it means to engage in meaningful ways of learning that are community-centered, that are care-centered, and are also sort of pushing an intellectual or challenging intellectually.
Leanne, is there anything you'd like to add?
I don't think that I do have anything to add, but it's been a really lovely conversation.
Yeah, wonderful to chat with you again, Leanne, and look forward to your talk this evening.
Thanks so much for having me.
Below the Radar is a knowledge democracy podcast created by SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Thanks for listening to our conversation with Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. Head to the show notes to learn more about Leanne's work. You can also find a link to our 2021 episode with Leanne, Theory of Ice, in the resources section. If you would like to support our podcast, you can donate at the link in the description below. Your generous donation will help support the podcast's activities and associated public events with SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time on Below the Radar.